Welcome back, everybody. And it's been a little while since we had a box quite this big on the bench. This is from our friends over at Trendnet, and this happens to be some engineering samples. So these are products that are going to be available at retail, and potentially are going to be available at retail by the time you see this video. But our units were sent ahead of full retail availability. So if I start picking on, or if I'm going through it and I say, oh look, there's a screw missing, well, somebody grabbed this thing off a test bench and put it back together to send to me, and it was not meant to be examined for all of that. So we've got two different switches in here. We've got the TPE-30284 and the TG160H, which are a mouthful as far as names go. And you know, I was told these were engineering samples, but the TPE-TG160H is fully sealed, and the TPE-30284 is not. So we're going to be a little more lenient on that one. You know, if there's mistakes in the manual, if something's missing from the box. This came off a test bench. So let's start with the TG160H. This is the, I say simpler, this is the smaller of the two. This is a 16-port gigabit PoE plus switch, and what's fantastic about this one is this is a fanless switch. So I've tried fanless PoE switches before, and I've run into a couple of issues. Their PoE budgets weren't high enough, they would overheat, and they weren't actually designed to be used in a 19-inch rack. It's part of how I ended up with the CRS324 that I've got. This one has a 123 watt PoE budget. And does it say what it's available per port? 30 watts per port. So what I was running into is I've got some big Ubiquiti UAC AP Pro units, and under full load those would pull more power out of a port than my last fanless PoE switch could handle, and it would just lock up. And I'm going to have to look at the model number from that. It wasn't a Trendnet switch, that was actually a TP-Link model, if memory serves. But yeah, no, that's basically the base specs on it. There's no notice about this being like a smart switch or anything. This is just a dumb PoE switch, which is fine. No fan, 16-port PoE plus. If you have an office and you've got, you know, IP phones, which are something we've talked about, or IP cameras, and you just need a switch to do a dedicated network for those things, this is great. And the fact that it is 19-inch rack mount compatible is an excellent addition. I find using racks to organize things makes my life so much easier. Alright, so this opens from the side, it doesn't open from the front, and then this whole thing just slides out. We get a safety note that basically comes down to it's an electrical device, don't zap yourself. We get a need help, register your product guide. We get a quick install guide. Let's take a look at that. Should just basically be take it out of the box, plug it in. And yeah, that's basically what this shows. So they show you linking it to the router, and then they show you hooking it up to a camera, an access point, a camera. They don't show phones, which are actually one thing that this is probably really good at, being fanless. Especially since phones don't need a whole ton of bandwidth. Cameras, I could potentially saturate a 1 gig link. Phones, not so much. And then the rest of this is just declaration of conformity, Warranty under normal use, specific warranty periods are listed on the product page. That's great. Does it say the warranty on the box? It's probably 1 year or 2 years. Let's look it up real quick. 3-year warranty. Oh, that's not bad. Yeah, so phones are probably something that I would love a switch like this for. If you've got a group of 8 or so cubicles, you could very easily run an uplink port to your phone stack to this, and then just hook all the phones that are up in that set of cubes to this. And because this is fanless, it's not going to cause any additional noise. So looking at the design, I'm very impressed with what I feel. This chassis is solid. It is steel, which probably wouldn't have been my first choice. I might have gone with aluminum. But solid steel. I can see some massive heat sinks through the vents. We've got venting on 3 of the 4 sides. I would have liked to have seen some additional venting, drilled in above the ports. We've seen that on other gear before. But that's not terrible. And then, if I'm not mistaken, this is our power brick. So this is an FSP manufactured brick. 54 volts, 2.78 amps, which translates to 150 watts. A little bit more than the 123 watt budget they say that it is capable of handling. And then in this end, I should have a few different accessories. So we've got some feet and some screws. If you look at the bottom, there are little... I expected these to be recessed, but they're just stamped and marked with the faintest line spots for you to install the rubber feet. We have some rack ears, which these are larger than we normally see on like a 28-port switch or a 54-port switch, but that's just due to the small nature of this device. I'm impressed they used a 4-hole pattern. So there's 4 holes, or there'll be 4 screws that are securing each ear. Although there's only, I take that back, there are 3 holes in the case itself. So that's an odd decision to use the... They used a 4-hole pattern so that they only had to make 1 rack ear. They put 3 screw holes in the switch, and then they put 4 holes in the ears so that they only had to include, or they only had to design 1 ear. This ear and this ear are the same. They're also reversible. You can do them in this direction, which will tend to leave the switch a little more flush with the rack. Or if you want it to stick out, depending on how it's being mounted and where, you can twist them around like that, and that'll force the whole thing forward just a little. So I'm actually intrigued by that. It's fanless. Normally I would power this thing on and say, let's look at the web interface, or let's listen to the noise it makes. There's no fan, and it's a dumb switch, so there's no web interface. And my testing is basically going to consist of, can I push a gigabit through the ports, and what happens if I feed it 150 watts worth of stuff? Because it's really all I can do to it. And this is the part that I said I didn't like about these Warrior screwdrivers. But with that, a little bit of a flick to break at the thread sealing, and we get right in. That's it. 3 screws on the back. And then this just slides right off. And we've got a really simple board. So let's take a look here. These are Bitech 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So each one of those is hooked up to 2 ports. We've got a couple of capacitors in here that don't appear to have a brand name. KY. So they're KY. I'll have to look that one up. I want to say that I know what that is, but I'm drawing a blank at the moment. And then we've just got a bunch of screws holding this board, and most of this board is really dedicated to these chips here, which we'll go ahead and see what switch chip we're using in a second here. And then the rest of it's just some power management. So we've got, I'm going to guess, 1 power management chip and 1 switch chip. I'm betting this one's the power management chip too, come to think of it. There's a lot more going on underneath this board than I thought there was at first. All right, just a little lever action there, and that pops right off. Well, I was expecting to see something underneath when I saw that giant thermal pad. I was also not anticipating that. I can't remove these heat sinks without destroying this switch. So instead of using screws to secure the heat sinks or using metal clips, these have little aluminum legs that are pushed through and then soldered to the board. So in order to remove them, to examine what switch and what power management IC they've used, I would have to desolder them from the board, which we're not going to do, since I should probably, leave this in working condition so that I can do some testing on it. We get a couple of what looks like SMD diodes and some capacitors over there. That all appears to be related to power regulation. In fact, I see a similar bank here and a similar bank there. What do we have that we can actually read on this thing? So I've got a Broadcom SoC, BCW59011. Did I read that right? BCW59011. Which leads to absolutely nothing of value. I'll have to look that up again later. And then we've got a lot of these LVC244As. There's another Broadcom chip over here. BCW59011A0WLG. Looking at it, I think these Broadcom chips might actually be involved in handling who gets 54-volt PoE and when. There's no heatsink on them. They're definitely not actually handling power going through them of any substantial quantity. But they're definitely making decisions about it. What an odd design. When I'm done with my testing, I may open this back up and desolder those heat sinks to see what's under them. Because I'm curious. I'm also very surprised to see a design like that. Although, I'm not actually upset about it. So, from my standpoint as a reviewer, obviously I want to be able to get in and look at things. But, from the standpoint of someone who would actually deploy one of these, soldering those heat sinks to the board is one way to guarantee that they're not going to come loose. You would have to damage the PCB to knock the heatsink loose. And considering the metal shell and otherwise fairly rugged construction, that design choice makes sense. That if you deployed one of these anywhere where it would potentially experience a rough service life, that you don't want your heat sinks to pop loose. Why would this PCB, which isn't particularly large, be held down by 6 screws? Other vendors would have been perfectly happy to use plastic clips or 2 screws or 4, but 6 seems excessive, especially 6 screws with these compression washers on them. So they have a washer and then they have a split washer. This thing was designed to take just a little bit of a beating. I mean, you don't want to go out and hit it with a baseball bat. And if you're buying your network gear in order to abuse it with sports equipment, probably something else going on. But it is designed to be a little more durable than some of the other cheaper equipment that I've seen and looked at. And overall, I can't say that they didn't use a cheap switch chip, but it doesn't look like they've cut any corners in the design here. Okay. So that was our real quick dive into the TPE-TG160H. And that G in the model number is important because there is a T160H that is a 10100. And just a quick recap. This is the type of switch that I personally would deploy in... Hey, that's the wrong Phillips. That's why that's slipping. In a call center environment, somewhere where I've got some PoE devices that I want to run. Most phones don't use more than 10 watts. So although I wouldn't necessarily want to run all 16 ports on phones, I would run 10. No problem. And be happy about that. Like I said, 8 is really the largest group that I normally have cubicles in. So 8 phones, give yourself an uplink, and you're good to go. You can also run non-PoE devices on this, but I'm less likely to suggest doing that with only a single gigabit uplink, depending on what you're doing. And what I mean by that is, if you're just using your PC to browse the internet and maybe look at spreadsheets and that type of stuff, here's a list of people that you should call. Yeah, a gigabit uplink shared between 4 or 6 people is not an issue. But if you are downloading any files of substantial size or moving large volumes of data, a gigabit uplink will very quickly become a bottleneck. I do want to comment on one other thing before I box this up and move on to the larger unit, which will take us a little bit more time. is that they did use a 3-pin power on this. I'm glad to see that they used a grounded power connector from a safety standpoint. And this is one of the ones with the extended ground pin, so that will make or break first. Or so that will make first and break last, I should say. So that's good attention to detail. The one thing that they didn't do that I really would have liked seeing, because, you know, rack mount gear with these hanging power supplies is always a problem in large environments, is I have seen some, and I'll put a link to one in the description if I can find one that I want to include. I've seen some of these with a latching power connector, where it actually has a push button and there are some spring-loaded contacts that grab onto the plugs with more force than a standard plug. So I would have liked to have seen that just as a value add. That's not actually something that should have been required by any stretch of the imagination, but it would have been nice to see. And I don't remember how that came out. Ah, there we go. There we go. All right, everybody's happy and back in their box. And I will take time to torture that. If there's something that you're curious about seeing, like I said, I'm going to hook as much PoE gear as I have available to me up to it, just to see what happens if I push it past its power limit. But if there's something specific you'd like me to test, let me know in the comments below, and I will do my best to accommodate that. Now, on to the monster. We've actually looked at a switch in this class before. And that's going to be some tough competition, because this is a WebSmart switch, and that had a little bit more available to it on the software side, although, or I should say from the software side, although the hardware, the underlying hardware in here, may actually be more capable. And what I'm referring to there, well, here, let's just double check. So we've got 4 10 gig SFP slots, support for, you know, VLANs, IGMP, quality of service, etc. On 24 ports, a 370 watt power budget, and I believe the same 3-year warranty as the other switch. But you know what? For the sake of it, let's just double check that warranty figure before I get too far ahead of myself. TPE-30284. Lifetime warranty. Okay. So that's actually a step up. And that is one place where I will say that Trendnet is doing better than MikroTik. Was that the MikroTik switch basically had a warranty that was handled by the retailers. That's one department that they're just not great at. It's not that they're actively bad, they just have less than stellar support compared to a vendor like Trendnet. So that is worth something. So especially with a lifetime warranty. 370 watt PoE budget, 4 10 gig SFPs, gigabit, and WebSmart. That puts this squarely in competition with the CRS-328 that we looked at. And our accessories include another power cord and a couple of rack ears, as well as a set of rubber feet. And these are just standard 4-hole short rack ears, like I see in all sorts of stuff. There's our safety note. Here's our quick install guide, which you'll notice is a little bit more in depth. Plug it in to your network. Fit standard racks. Here's a list of optional SFP modules. hardware installation configuration, default username, password, saving your settings to flash, and then we get the same thing in French, German, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, and Russian. Register your product, probably a requisite for that lifetime warranty. Okay, so out of the gate, I see stuff that I like better than its smaller sibling, and that is 10 gig uplinks. I mean, they're just 10 gigs great. And I don't see any fit and finish problems with the Switch. I am not a fan of this mode button being as accessible as it is on a device that no one should be tinkering with once it's configured. But I do like that the reset is recessed, so no one can just press it by accident. And instead of putting the LEDs on the individual ports like we saw with the smaller Switch, they've put them all in a block here where it will power up different colors. So it will show green for a 1 gig link, 10100 for a, or orange for a 10100. PoE will be green or orange. There's a PoE indicator for power OK and power fail. And then your last 4 ports, which are 25 through 28, will be green for 10 gig and orange for a 1 gig link. And these are all fairly flush with the front. The SFP ports stick out a little bit from the case, a little more than I've seen on some other equipment. The locations for the rubber feet are actually stamped in and indented a little bit. We get vents on this side, and our fan intakes, or exhaust, haven't looked at which way they set the fans up. On the other, AC outlet on the back. You know what I don't see is, there they are. I was gonna say there should be screws to open up this thing. Before we get too far ahead of yourself, I do like the choice to space out the SFP ports like that. I have the CRS328. It's in my rack. It's what I use every day for my home network. And the SFP Plus ports are stacked 2 and 2. And I understand why they did it, and that's a fairly common thing to see, but it does invite the potential to accidentally knock a module loose when you're trying to remove an adjacent module. So stacking or separating them out like this is a nice little quality of life decision. I'm not a huge fan of putting the block of LEDs here. I do like being able to look at the port that I'm trying to diagnose and seeing the lights there. That said, some people like this, so I can't say Trendnet did anything wrong. It's just different than what I would have preferred. And that's interesting. This whole front appears to be like a sticker adhered to the metal. All right, so with that out of the way, now this whole front starts to come off, and you have to be very careful when dismantling this switch. And this is part of why I did it at the angle that I did. So there is a connector here that appears to be glued in for that front panel. So what we're going to do is very carefully just stand that end up. So they've got a modular connector in there so that theoretically this board is replaceable if something happens to it. But then they've gone and hot glued it in on both sides. So don't really know what they're doing there. So this is protection. And this is actually something we have seen before. This is what we saw on the CRS-328, is that there's a riser board here. And we'll disconnect it. Once again, a little bit overzealous with the screws. Not that I'm complaining from a durability standpoint. That's probably why there's a gob of hot glue on that as well. And would you look at that? So the fans have this little metal, is that metal? Feels like hard plastic with a piece of metal in it. Tube that comes out and is bent to help keep the fan cables out of trouble. So that's interesting. All right, so with that out of the way, come on. All right, so this board has a power cable coming directly from the power supply. And this is going to be the board that handles sending power over Ethernet through the individual switch groups. And we can see that it has a plug for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Which means that if there's 24, that means they're handling them in sets of 4. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yep, so they're doing groups of 4 switches, which jives with everything that I can see here. We've got a communication portion here, which is going to connect to the CPU, or I shouldn't say CPU, the microcontroller that's in here. I do, unfortunately, see something carried over from the other design, and that is these little metal pins that I know at this point go through this printed circuit board and are then soldered, which means I can't tell you what SoC is in here from visual inspection on the board, which sucks. But we can look at this now. So this is a fairly standard ribbon cable and connector. And theoretically, you know, if one of your LEDs failed, you'd actually have to replace this whole subboard. And it's possible to do if you were to pry this hot glue out of there. But it's not easy to do because of that. So that's an interesting choice. All right, so there's that. We've got our 6 PHY chips. We've got these here, which I'm sure are related to the fact that this is... So we've got our PHY chips. We've got those. We're going to have a controller here, but I can't tell what it is. This is part of where I said it's a pre-production unit. So normally there would be a serial number and a MAC sticker here. Obviously those are missing in this unit. Lattice LCMX02. So that's a little FPGA, which is interesting. There's a couple of spots here for capacitors that aren't populated, which isn't uncommon to see. It looks like there is a spot here for another Ethernet port that's not present, and I really wish they would have made that available. Normally you get a Ethernet plug on an enterprise or an entry or an upper end business switch for. There's an Ethernet jack here that's not populated. Normally what we would have had on a device like this is a console port, and that's normally just a 10100 with a dedicated PHY and a little microcontroller that goes to it that allows you to connect to a serial console over the network to configure the switch. And that may indicate that there is another model or models that share this same circuit board. It would be very easy to use this same PCB and make a non-PoE version of this switch, because all you have to do is emit this and put in a smaller power supply. The rest of the componentry, I mean, there's going to be other things you depopulate because you don't need some of the power management, but isn't going to change. So there's that lattice. Looks like it's using Diana memory. I can see what looks like a single memory module package here, sticking out from the edge of the heatsink. Unfortunately, I can't remove this heatsink as much as I would love to, due to their innovative way of attaching them. Which actually, I guess, really cuts this short, other than checking who they used capacitors from. UMEC. Okay, no. That's not the capacitor maker. Rubicon. These are Rubicon capacitors. Okay. That's the same stuff we saw when we did the MikroTik. Overall, there's a couple of things that I'm surprised to see on this board. Like I said, having these soldered down is kind of surprising. I mentioned that I'm surprised we don't get a console port, especially since there's provisions for one. I don't see the model number anywhere on the PCB at all, although that may change. For production, yeah, there's just no way to tell exactly from the PCB at any rate if they use this in other models, because I don't see a part number or model number on the PCB, at least on this side. And I mean, I could take the whole thing out just to check for that. Screw it. Why not? We're here. I've come this far. Probably don't have to remove that screw. You know what? If I designed this, I would have to remove that screw. Oh, did they do what I think they did? They did. Do these fit my standoff tool that I made? Would you look at that? The standoffs help hold the board to the container, and lo and behold, my handy dandy little standoff tool just happens to fit. I'm not even going to comment if the full video is live yet or not, because it's been a monster to edit. But I actually made this in that build video that we've been working on. And there's a model number on here either. It's just... it's kind of disappointing. Even if I just found something on one of these silk screens that said, you know, TPE-30284, that would be satisfying. is the term I guess I'll use. But no, there's not a model number on here. And on top of that, when I flipped it over, that screw fell. There's a screw here. And I think I heard one fall into the power supply, and then I think that was it. Okay. Oh, one thing I do want to note on the power supply, these little gray lumps appear to be over normal MOSFETs, but they appear to be some sort of thermal conductive cover for them. So instead of just using some thermal goop and a screw to hold it to the aluminum plate here, they've actually got a little cover that goes over top of it. And I don't know if that's necessarily better or worse, but it's different. And these fans are by YS Tech, by the way. These are DC brushless fans, FD124020EB-N. They're rated at 0.17 amps. So let's go ahead and put this back together. And hopefully the final production version of this has a model number on the PCB. I'm actually impressed it got this far, and there just isn't one. I mean, unless it's buried under one of these heat sinks where I can't read it, this doesn't tell me who made it or what model it is or anything. And I definitely see here that there were provisions for more stuff than is on this board. I see an unpopulated P1 on the front. That tells me that this board is or was used on a switch that has a DC jack on the front. I see a fan 6 section over here, which tells me that there were potentially intent to include 2 more fans here, although I don't see a fan 3, fan 4. I take that back. I see fan 1 and I see fan 3, so I don't see fans 2 and 4. J1, J15. Yeah, I don't see where they would have put the other 2 fans at all. Although you definitely, looking at the case, can see that it is punched out for 2 additional fans right here. And the opposite side of the case is punched out for 4 fans as well. Very interesting. Now, how many of those things are in use elsewhere? And how many of them are simply holdovers from a different circuit board design? I don't know. Certainly would be interesting to find out. unfortunately, these are the only TP-Link switches I have, and it's not quite as obvious on these compared to, say, the CRS-354, where it was quite clear that both versions of 354 for MikroTik used the same circuit board with a different power supply included in them. All right. So I'm going to plug this in first, which, full credit to Trendnet here, these power connectors are both keyed and locking. So there's a dedicated notch on one side to allow you to install it the correct way. There is a locking lever there, and they also designed them to be reversible. I've got 2 ground pins and 2 voltage pins on the connector that theoretically, and I'm not going to test this because, you know, I don't want to blow this up if I'm wrong, but theoretically, if you installed it backwards, because my, well, 54 volt pins are on the outside and my grounds are on the inside, it would work and not care. Although it wouldn't latch properly. And I seem to be short a screw unless it rolled somewhere. So I'm going to have to tip this a little bit. Be very careful of this cable to find where my missing screw has gotten to. There it is. It was behind it. And I do like that, although the odds are against any of this shorting out. Now, other than these 2 really long solder points here, you know, nothing should potentially be able to contact the metal of the case. They provide this basically 1/4 inch thick foam sticky pad. And that just goes here, and its whole purpose is to make sure that none of those solder legs can short out. And I mean, that's perfectly fine. They've got a similar provision here. There's a large plastic sheet that goes over where the power supply is. Not that any of the power supply components really look tall enough for that. That probably also helps with airflow, and you know, probably can't help that much with airflow, but alright, so let's put it back together. No worse for the wear. The metal is a little thin on the lid here. Something's rattling around. What did we forget to screw in? Okay, I have a screw Where did it go? Aha! I set the screw here, but never tightened it. So let that be a lesson to anyone working on stuff like this. Just tip it around a little when you go to put it back together, because the last thing you want to do is put something like this out in the field and then find out 2 years later that it got bumped and a screw that you thought you installed blew up. And as to why someone would open a network switch, it is a fairly common practice in certain levels to replace the fans. And I believe I mentioned that when we were doing our microtick stuff, was that there are environments where the fans in there either make too much noise or are just not quite up to par. And it's not uncommon, and one of the latches on the back didn't seat right, to see people swap them out for Noctua fans if they want quieter ones, or various forms of DC fan for the preferred brand. I don't know how loud this switch is yet. It has the potential to be just as quiet as my 328, or as loud as that CRS 354 we had in here that just screamed the whole time. And a lot of that is going to come down to Trendnet's software, because from a functional standpoint, yes, it's a 300 watt device, but that's not a whole ton of power. The fact that they only used 2 fans, I'm not a huge fan of. No pun intended. I would have liked to have seen 4. 4 fans at a lower speed can move just as much air as 2 fans at a higher speed while making less noise, as long as all else is equal. So I would have liked to have seen that. That said, I'm hoping that at least under no load or low load, that this thing just doesn't make any noise at all. So let's do that. And I'll probably need to get a laptop to connect to it in a minute here, but let's go ahead and plug it into our kilowatt here so we can see what it does on boot as far as power use is concerned. And I don't think I'm going to be able to push this one to its limit on the PoE side. I'd love to say that I will. I don't think I own 300 watts of PoE stuff that I can plug into it. It's not to say that I don't necessarily have access to that. Well, this is not terrible. This isn't great. I'm hoping to hear it spin down in a minute here. Okay, not bad. More fan noise than you want if you're using this in any acoustically sensitive environment, especially as what appears to be at idle. Those sound like they're spinning somewhere between 500 and 1,000 RPM still. But although inside a rack, they'd be kind of muffled. At about 15, 16 watts at idle. It's booted up, it's not doing anything. Anyway, as far as performance is concerned, I'm definitely going to play with the 10 gig ports, going to see how those behave. I think I'm going to do a dedicated video on the Trendnet software, as we're coming in close to an hour. I mean, I'm past an hour, but I'll edit some of that down in post. And this is the hardware portion of it. Let's get it out of the box. Let's dig into the hardware. And yeah, it's a little on the noisier side. One thing that I do know is lacking on Trendnet's side, this is not saying they're bad at anything, is that they don't necessarily have all the 10 gig devices that you would want out of the box today. Now, this switch should, and very likely will, work just fine with other vendors' 10 gig attachments, but you can't necessarily treat Trendnet as a one-stop shop for those today. This is one of the first Trendnet 10 gig devices I've gotten my hands on, which, new on the market, likely means that there will be more to follow after that, especially since I think this manual called out accessories that mostly look like 10100 SFP modules. So I think their SFP Plus modules are coming, they're just not here today. Alright, that's all we've got for today. Like I said, I'll deal with the software in a dedicated video. What does this mode button do? What does that mode button do? Oh, okay, I understand now. The mode button that I was upset about earlier is not actually as big of a problem as I thought. So it shows you PoE, power OK, power fail here, and if you press and hold the mode button, right now it's in link and activity mode, which is going to show you the data rate, whether it's gigabit or 10100 for your ports, or gigabit or 10 gig for these. And if I press it and hold it, it goes to PoE mode, which should then theoretically tell me power OK or power fail for the first 24 ports. It really shouldn't do anything different on the 10 gigs because you don't get PoE in an SFP Plus module. There's no way to do that today. You can get PoE and 10 gig, you just can't do it via SFP. Alright, anyway, I was trying to finish this up so that it wasn't necessarily a full hour after editing. I want to thank Trendnet for sending these over. I mentioned that these are pre-production units, so some of the stuff that I said, where is this? Like, I can't find a model number on that printed circuit board. Very easily may be there in production. And some of the stuff that looks like it was just kind of left over from an old design could also be removed from the final version of that circuit board as well. So I want to thank them for sending these over. I want to thank anyone who helps support Pocketables, either using our Amazon affiliate links or via Patreon, for helping make videos like this possible. And I know I say that every video, and it's true every single time. It is support like that that helps keep this going, encourages us to talk to vendors, encourages us to buy the things that we need to help cover some of these. Sometimes I'm going to have to go buy a couple of SFP Plus modules to properly test this, since most of mine are in use semi-permanently. And then I want to thank Electrix for providing our opening and closing themes. If you like what you hear, definitely go check his channel out. And even if you don't, my creative input had some influence there, so check him out anyway. And lastly, thank you for watching.